On a crisp autumn night in 1988, in the historic heart of Charleston, South Carolina, a bride-to-be named Eleanor Vance walked out of a restaurant and vanished from the face of the earth. She left behind a loving family, a heartbroken fiancé, and a wedding dress that would never be worn. For 35 years, her story had no ending. The investigation went cold, leaving her family with nothing but fading photographs and agonizing questions. It was as if the night itself had swallowed her whole. That is, until just last year, when a team of urban explorers pumping decades of stagnant water from the basement of an abandoned speakeasy found a small, corroded tin box wedged behind a loose brick. Inside that box was Eleanor's engagement ring, but it wasn't the ring that finally broke the silence. It was the impossible clue found with it, a tiny slip of paper that would not only solve her disappearance but unravel a sinister plot, proving that the monster responsible had been hiding in plain sight all along. Before she was a mystery, Eleanor Vance was a woman of vision. In the fall of 1988, at just 26 years old, she was an architect on the rise in a city defined by its historic beauty. Charleston was her canvas. She saw stories in the ironwork of its gates and poetry in the precise lines of its grand antebellum homes. Her drafting table was her sanctuary, a landscape of trace paper, sharpened pencils, and ambitious blueprints. Friends described Ellie as a force of nature. Her laughter was infectious, her optimism boundless. She didn't just design buildings. She imagined the lives that would unfold within them. Her own life was a blueprint she was drawing with meticulous, joyful detail. At the center of that blueprint was Richard Hayes. A promising young lawyer, Richard was the steady anchor to Ellie's creative whirlwind. They were a perfect Charleston couple, ambitious, in love, and with a future that seemed as bright and clear as a Carolina sky. Their wedding was just 6 weeks away. The planning had consumed her in the best possible way. Her younger sister, Laura, who was to be her maid of honor, remembers their days as a blur of happy errands. Archival photo of two young women, Ellie and Laura, laughing. Laura recalls long afternoons spent debating the merits of cream versus white gardenias, and the day Ellie finally found her wedding dress. It was a simple, elegant gown with delicate lace sleeves. Seeing her in it, Laura would later say, was like seeing her sister's future materialize in a single perfect moment. But the most cherished part of her future was the ring she wore on her left hand. It wasn't just a ring, it was a promise and a piece of family history. Several months earlier, her father, Markham Vance, a quiet and thoughtful history professor, had called her into his study. He presented her with a small velvet box. Inside wasn't a ring, but a single deep blue sapphire, the color of the ocean at dusk. It had belonged to his grandmother. With tears in his eyes, he told Ellie that the stone represented a legacy of strong women and enduring love. Ellie had the stone set in a custom platinum band, flanked by two small, brilliant-cut diamonds. The ring was a fusion of her past and her future. It rarely left her finger. October 28, 1988, began as any other Friday. Ellie spent the morning at her firm, making final adjustments to a design for a new community library. She was vibrant and focused, leaving her colleagues with a cheerful "have a great weekend" as she left for the day. Her future seemed as solid as the foundations she designed. That evening, she and Richard had a dinner reservation at the Gilded Lily, an upscale restaurant nestled on a cobblestone street in the French Quarter. The goal was to finalize the guest list and, more importantly, the seating chart for the wedding reception, a task known to test the diplomacy of even the most devoted couples. The restaurant was an island of warmth against the cool autumn air. Inside, over plates of she-crab soup and seared scallops, they debated the delicate politics of placing relatives next to old college friends. The conversation was normal, punctuated by familiar laughter. But as the evening wore on, a small point of friction emerged. Richard, stressed from a demanding week at his law firm, was insistent on placing a particular uncle at a table far from the head table. Ellie, ever the architect of social harmony, disagreed. It was a minor, insignificant argument, the kind couples have and forget moments later. But in the vacuum of what was to come, its details would be scrutinized, magnified, and twisted into something sinister. Around 10:30 p.m. they left the Gilded Lily. The air was cool and carried the salty scent of the nearby harbor. The cobblestone street was quiet, bathed in the soft yellow glow of gas lamps. Richard, wanting to put the silly argument behind them, walked a few paces ahead to retrieve his car from a small private lot just around the corner. He later told police he heard a faint scream, a brief, sharp sound, but in a city that is always alive with noise, the distant call of a gull, the clang of a trolley, the revelry from a nearby bar, he dismissed it. He thought nothing of it. It was a mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his life. When he pulled his dark sedan up to the curb in front of the restaurant just a minute or two later, the spot where he had left Ellie was empty. He waited. A minute passed, then two. He got out of the car, his earlier frustration turning into a knot of confusion, then concern. He called her name. The only answer was the rustling of oak leaves skittering across the pavement. Then he saw it. Her leather purse was lying on the ground near the curb. Its contents, a wallet, keys, a tube of lipstick, were spilled across the dark cobblestones as if dropped in a sudden, violent struggle. His eyes scanned the ground, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw her wallet. He saw her keys. But something was missing, something that was always there. He looked at her hand in his mind's eye, a picture he knew so well, and he realized what wasn't there on the ground. Her engagement ring, the platinum band with his promise and her family's legacy, was gone. And so was she. Eleanor Vance, the woman of vision, the bride-to-be, had vanished into the Charleston night. The hours that followed Eleanor Vance's disappearance were a blur of flashing blue and red lights against the historic brickwork of Charleston. The initial response from the Charleston Police Department was swift. They cordoned off the block, and officers fanned out, their flashlights cutting sharp beams through the darkness. But the city's charming, narrow streets, which felt so romantic by day, now seemed to hold 1,000 shadows, 1,000 secrets. From the very beginning, the investigation had a singular, intense focus. Richard Hayes, in the cold, sterile environment of an interrogation room, the story of his last night with Ellie was picked apart, piece by piece. To the detectives, the narrative seemed tragically familiar. A young couple, a minor argument over wedding plans. It was a classic catalyst for a domestic dispute that ends in violence. Richard's story, though consistent, had a fatal flaw, an absence of proof. He couldn't prove he hadn't harmed Ellie in those crucial, unaccounted-for minutes. He told them everything, his voice strained with a mixture of grief and disbelief. He recounted the silly argument, the walk to the car, the faint sound he dismissed as city noise. But the more he insisted on his innocence, the more the detective's suspicion seemed to harden. He was the last person to see her alive. In the grim calculus of a homicide investigation, that made him the prime suspect. The search for evidence began. Divers scoured the murky waters of the nearby Cooper River. K-9 units searched parks and wooded areas on the outskirts of the city. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on every door, but no one had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary. The Gilded Lily's staff confirmed the couple's argument was minor, but in the absence of other leads, even a small detail could be cast in a sinister light. The local news media caught wind of the story, and soon, Ellie's smiling face was on the front page of every newspaper, beside a picture of a stone-faced Richard Hayes being escorted into the police station. The court of public opinion was far quicker to reach a verdict than a court of law. To many, he was already guilty. Investigators latched onto the missing engagement ring. They believed it was a key piece of evidence. A mugging gone wrong was an early theory, but it didn't align with the fact that Ellie's wallet, containing cash and credit cards, was left behind. The alternative theory was that the killer had taken it as a trophy. Detectives visited every pawn shop in Charleston and the surrounding counties. They showed Ellie's photo and a sketch of the custom ring. The answer was always the same. No one had seen it. Days turned into weeks. A potential break in the case came from an unlikely source. A woman who lived a few blocks away from the Gilded Lily called the tip line. She reported seeing a dark, windowless van parked near the restaurant on the night of the disappearance. She remembered it because it seemed out of place among the sedans and station wagons. But her description was vague. It was a common make and model, and she couldn't recall the license plate. Police followed the lead, investigating every registered van of that type in the area, but it led nowhere. Another dead end. With no body, no murder weapon, and no physical evidence linking him to a crime, the case against Richard Hayes remained purely circumstantial. The district attorney's office didn't have enough to press charges. After weeks of intense scrutiny, Richard was released, a free man in the eyes of the law, but a prisoner to the suspicion that would follow him for the rest of his life. The formal investigation wound down. Ellie's case file, once active and heavy with reports, was moved to a shelf, then to a filing cabinet, and finally to a box in the archives. It joined the ranks of the city's other cold cases, a silent, tragic collection of stories without a final chapter. For the Charleston Police Department, the case went cold, but for the Vance family, the search never ended. It became the defining feature of their existence. Markham Vance, the quiet professor of history, found himself locked in a battle against time. He channeled his grief into a desperate, all-consuming quest for answers. He drained his retirement savings, hiring a revolving door of private investigators. Each one started with confidence, re-interviewing the same people, chasing the same faded leads, and ultimately delivering the same heartbreaking conclusion. There was nothing new to find. The posters of Ellie's smiling face, once plastered on every telephone pole and storefront window, began to fade and peel, a symbol of his own waning hope. Laura Vance, who should have been celebrating her sister's new life, was instead forced to navigate her own in the shadow of an immense loss. The trauma of Ellie's disappearance became a ghost in her life. She found it hard to form relationships, to plan for a future, when her sisters had been so brutally stolen. The joy she once shared with Ellie was replaced by a quiet, persistent ache. And then there was Richard Hayes. The cloud of suspicion clung to him like the humid Charleston air. Friends fell away. He was passed over for promotions at his law firm. The whispers followed him everywhere, in the grocery store, at the gas station. Unable to bear the constant judgment in a city that was once his home, he eventually packed his bags and left. He moved to a new state, hoping to outrun a past that wasn't his, a crime he didn't commit. But the ghost of Ellie Vance and the world's belief that he was responsible for her fate was a part of him now. The years turned into a decade. The 1990s gave way to a new millennium. Technology surged forward. DNA became a household name. The internet connected the world. But for Ellie's case, time remained frozen. Her story became a piece of Charleston lore, a cautionary tale whispered to tourists about the city's hidden darkness. To the world, Eleanor Vance was a tragic headline, a cold case file. But for her father and her sister, she remained a constant presence. She was the empty chair at every holiday dinner, the unanswered phone on every birthday. The search for answers had failed, leaving behind only a vast, aching silence. They were a family adrift, haunted by the question that had no answer. Where was Ellie? They had no idea that the answer wasn't buried in the woods or lost to the tides. It was waiting, preserved by chance and circumstance, in a place no one ever thought to look, submerged in darkness and water, just a few hundred yards from where she was last seen alive. For 35 years, the story of Eleanor Vance remained dormant, a fossil preserved in the amber of memory and forgotten police files. The silence was broken not by a detective or a deathbed confession, but by a new generation of investigators, armed with cameras and a relentless curiosity for the secrets hidden within their city's decaying walls. They called themselves Past Finders, a small team of amateur historians and urban explorers. Their mission was to digitally preserve Charleston's forgotten places before they were lost to demolition and development. In the late summer of 2023, they were granted access to their most challenging subject yet, the condemned Starlight Lounge. From the street, the building was an eyesore, a derelict two-story structure just 2 blocks from the Gilded Lily. Its windows were boarded up, its facade stained with decades of grime. But in its heyday, the Starlight Lounge had been a notorious speakeasy-style bar, a place of hushed deals and illicit pleasures, run by a man with a dangerous reputation. Now it was slated to be torn down to make way for a luxury hotel. The team, led by a local historian named Ben, navigated the main floor with caution. Dust hung thick in the air, dancing in the beams of their powerful flashlights. The ghosts of old laughter and clinking glasses seemed to hang in the silence. But their true goal was in the basement. Local legend held that the basement had been the heart of the speakeasy, a place that was hastily abandoned after a raid. A burst pipe decades prior had flooded the space completely, and the owners, rather than deal with the damage, had simply sealed the door, locking its history away. The team set up a powerful pump, feeding a hose out into the alley. For hours, the machine churned, pumping out a thick black water that smelled of rust and decay. As the water level slowly receded, the top of a doorway was revealed. They broke the seal and descended into the muck. The scene that greeted them was a time capsule from a forgotten world. Rotted bar stools lay on their sides, half submerged in the thick sludge. A heavy, cast-iron safe, its door firmly shut, stood against one wall like a silent sentinel. Everything was coated in a thick layer of slick, brown grime. It was exactly the kind of historical treasure trove they had hoped to find. As Ben filmed the safe, another team member, Maria, was scanning the brick walls. She noticed something odd near the safe, a single brick that seemed newer than the others, set with a sloppier layer of mortar. On a hunch, she took out a pry bar and began to work at the edges. The mortar crumbled easily. She pulled the brick free. Behind it was a small, dark cavity. Reaching inside, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. She pulled it out into the light. It was a small tin box, the size of a deck of cards, corroded, with rust but still intact. It was surprisingly heavy. Gathered around, the team stared at the box. What could be inside? Old coins? A stash of illicit memorabilia? With a screwdriver, Ben carefully pried the rusted lid open. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed in the damp, silent room. The lid popped open. Inside, nestled on a bed of what was once velvet, now rotted and black, lay a single object. It was a platinum ring. At its center was a large, brilliant sapphire flanked by 2 diamonds that still caught the beam of their flashlights with a faint, defiant sparkle. A stunned silence fell over the group. Ben and Maria, both Charleston natives, knew the story of Eleanor Vance. They had seen the pictures of the ring in old newspaper articles. It was unmistakable, but it made no sense. What was Ellie's ring doing here? In the sealed basement of a notorious old bar she had no connection to? They carefully lifted the ring from the box, and that's when they saw it, tucked. Beneath the rotted lining, preserved against all odds by the tight seal of the box, was a tiny, folded slip of paper. It was impossibly fragile. Using a pair of tweezers from their kit, Ben gently unfolded it. The paper was a pawn ticket. The ink was faded but still legible. The date was printed clearly, November 1st, 1988, just 3 days after Ellie vanished. It was issued from a pawn shop in a town 30 miles away. The ticket listed the pawned item, one man's gold wristwatch, and beneath that, a space for the client's name, filled out with 2 handwritten initials, VR. The team stared at the tiny piece of paper. They understood immediately. The ring was the headline, the emotional center of the discovery. But this ticket, this was the key. This was the impossible clue that had survived for 35 years in the dark. The discovery of that ring in such an unlikely place left investigators with more questions than answers. It's incredible how a single item can rewrite history. If you, like me, are fascinated by these mysteries, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss a single twist. The call from the Past Finders team sent a shockwave through the Charleston Police Department. A case that was little more than a ghost in their filing system was suddenly, explosively, alive. Within an hour, the flooded basement of the Starlight Lounge, once a forgotten historical footnote, was an active crime scene, taped off and swarming with forensic technicians. The rusted tin box and its precious contents were carefully transported to the state crime lab. The Ellie Vance case, cold for 35 years, was officially reopened, and it was assigned to a detective who hadn't even been born when Ellie disappeared, Detective Isabella Rossi. Rossi was part of a new breed of investigator. Methodical, sharp, and fluent in the language of modern forensics, she approached cold cases not as historical puzzles, but as unsolved crimes waiting for the right technology to unlock them. She treated the evidence with a reverence born of understanding. To her, the tin box wasn't just an artifact. It was a black box, a time capsule that had perfectly preserved the truth of a crime. As her team got to work, Rossi sat down with the original case file, a mountain of paper filled with dead-end leads and the faded theories of a bygone era. She read about the intense focus on the fiancé, Richard Hayes, the dismissed report of a suspicious van, and the fruitless search for the ring. For hours, she immersed herself in the failure of 1988, all while the science of 2023 was working to finally find the path forward. The first results came from the ring itself. Forensic scientists carefully swabbed the interior of the platinum band. Even after decades submerged in water, the tight fit of a ring against skin can trap and preserve microscopic skin cells. Using a process called touch DNA analysis, a technology that was pure science fiction in 1988, the lab extracted a partial genetic profile. They rushed to compare it to the DNA from Ellie's parents, Markham and his late wife, which had been stored in a national database for missing persons. The result was a definitive match. The DNA on the ring belonged to the biological child of Markham Vance. It was, without a shadow of a doubt, Ellie's engagement ring. This crucial first step officially and scientifically linked the discovery to the victim. Next came the analysis of the tin box. The corroded surface was carefully examined for fingerprints, but decades of submersion had erased any usable prints. The real discovery came from the grime and sludge found inside the box. Using a mass spectrometer, the lab analyzed its composition. Mixed in with the rust and decay were trace elements of a very specific soil composite. On a hunch, Rossi dispatched a team to the Gilded Lily restaurant. They took soil samples from the large decorative planters that still lined the curb. Outside, planters that, according to the restaurant's records, were the very same ones from 1988. The lab results were another direct hit. The soil from the planters was a perfect match to the trace evidence found inside the tin box. This was a critical link. It proved that the box, and therefore likely the ring, had been at the scene of the crime on the night Ellie vanished. It wasn't something that was lost days or weeks later. It was connected to the moment of her disappearance. And more importantly, the analysis confirmed what wasn't in the box. No DNA, no fingerprints from Richard Hayes. The old theory was beginning to crumble, but the centerpiece of the new investigation was the tiny, folded pawn ticket. It was a document that should have turned to pulp years ago. Detective Rossi treated it like the Rosetta Stone of her case. Every piece of information on it was a clue. First, the location. Speedy Pawn, North Augusta. North Augusta was a town 30 miles from Charleston. This was significant. It suggested the person who pawned the item was trying to create distance from the crime in Charleston, where police were actively searching for clues. Second, the item, a man's gold wristwatch. Why would a mugger, who supposedly stole a valuable woman's ring, be pawning a man's watch just 3 days later? It didn't fit the narrative. It suggested a different story, one where the watch itself was a key part of the crime. And finally, the most promising lead of all, the initials. VR. Rossi's team immediately began running the initials against every database at their disposal. They cross-referenced registered business owners in Charleston from the late 1980s, vehicle registrations, and criminal records. The search was wide, but one name kept surfacing in connection to the area around the Gilded Lily and the Starlight Lounge: Vincent Rizzo. In 1988, Vincent "Vinny" Rizzo was the charismatic and widely feared owner of the Starlight Lounge. His name appeared in old police files for minor infractions, but there were always whispers of deeper, darker connections to organized crime. He was a man who operated in the shadows, and his initials were VR. Suddenly, the location of the discovery wasn't just a bizarre coincidence, it was a direct link. The ring was found in a building owned by a man with the same initials as the ones on a pawn ticket connected to the crime. Detective Rossi leaned back in her chair, the pieces clicking into place on the evidence board in her mind. The original investigation had been blinded by its focus on the fiancé. They believed the motive was a crime of passion, so they looked for evidence of passion. They had failed to consider that the motive could have been something else entirely. Obsession, opportunity, and cold-blooded criminality. The new evidence was painting a completely different picture. This wasn't a domestic dispute that spilled out into the street. The soil in the box suggested the crime started in the parking lot. The pawned watch suggested a secondary crime, perhaps a robbery to create a false trail. And the initials VR, coupled with the location of the ring, pointed to a new, formidable suspect who had never even been on the original investigator's radar. The ghost of Eleanor Vance finally had a voice, and it was leading Detective Rossi straight to the door of the Starlight Lounge and the man who ran it, Vinny Rizzo. The years of silence were over. The hunt had begun. Vincent Rizzo was no longer the shadowy figure from 1988. Detective Rossi's team quickly discovered that in the 35 years since Ellie Vance had disappeared, Vinny had cultivated the image of a legitimate, self-made man. He had sold the Starlight Lounge in the early 90s and invested in commercial real estate, amassing a small fortune. Now, in his late 70s, he lived in an opulent home in a gated community on Kiowa Island, a pillar of the local business community. He was, by all appearances, a man without a secret in the world. But Rossi knew that the deepest secrets are often hidden in the most open of places. Her first move was to follow the trail of the pawn ticket. The shop, Speedy Pawn, had closed down years ago, but public records led Rossi's team to its former owner, a man named Sal Moretti, now in his 80s, and living a quiet life in a retirement community. Initially, Sal was reluctant to talk. The name Vinny Rizzo pulled a cloud over his memory. But Rossi was patient. She showed him a copy of the ticket. She described the time, the place, and slowly the memory surfaced. He remembered the transaction not because of the watch, but because of the man who pawned it. Vinny Rizzo wasn't a regular customer. He was an intimidating presence, a man whose requests you didn't question. But then Rossi asked about the watch itself. "Do you remember anything about it, Sal? Any details?" Sal paused, his eyes searching the distant past. "Gold," he said. Finally. It was a nice piece. Heavy. But there was something else. An engraving. On the back. Rossi leaned forward, her recorder capturing every word. It was personal, like a gift. I remember thinking it was strange Vinny had it. It said something like, "To RH from EV." Detective Rossi felt a jolt. Richard Hayes. Eleanor Vance. The watch wasn't random. It was Richard's. Vinny Rizzo had pawned a watch belonging to the prime suspect just 3 days after the crime. This wasn't a false trail. It was a deliberate and calculated act of framing. The next step was one Rossi had to take herself. She flew to Denver, Colorado, where Richard Hayes now lived. She found him a changed man. The ambition and optimism of his youth had been replaced by a quiet weariness. He was a successful architect, but he had never remarried. He had lived his entire adult life under a shadow. When Rossi explained she had new information on Ellie's case, he was guarded, almost hostile, conditioned by decades of suspicion. But then she showed him a photo of the pawn ticket. "Mr. Hayes," she said gently, "we have reason to believe this ticket is for a gold wristwatch that belonged to you, a gift from Ellie." Richard stared at the image, his composure cracking for the first time. He confirmed it immediately. Ellie had given it to him for his birthday. He then told Rossi something that had been buried in the original police file, dismissed as irrelevant. A few days after Ellie disappeared, his apartment had been broken into. The place was messy, but only one thing of value was taken, the gold watch from his nightstand. "I told the detectives back then," Richard said, his voice thick with the memory of old frustrations. "They thought it was just a random burglary. They said it had nothing to do with the case." Rossi's heart ached for the man sitting opposite her. For 35 years, a piece of evidence that could have pointed away from him had been sitting in a file, ignored. She explained the new discoveries, the ring, the box, the initials on the ticket. For the first time in decades, someone was not just listening to Richard Hayes, but believing him. The interview ended with Richard in tears, not of grief, but of catharsis. A weight he had carried for more than half his life was finally being lifted. Back in Charleston, Rossi dug deeper into the connection between Rizzo and the original investigation. That's when she found him. Arthur Finch, the bartender from the Starlight Lounge. According to the 1988 file, Finch had been questioned about the suspicious van as he owned a similar vehicle, but he had a rock-solid alibi for the night of the disappearance, an alibi provided by his boss, Vinny Rizzo. It was a perfect circle of deception. Finch was the muscle and Rizzo was his protection. The pieces were all there, but they were circumstantial. Rossi needed a human element. She needed a witness. Her team began the painstaking work of tracking down every known employee of the Starlight Lounge from 1988. Most had moved on, their memories faded, but one name led them to a quiet suburban home in North Carolina, a former cocktail waitress named Diana. Now in her late 50s, Diana was terrified when Rossi's investigators knocked on her door. The fear associated with Vinnie Rizzo and the Starlight Lounge was still potent, but Rossi, speaking to her over the phone, offered her protection. She told her that this was the last, best chance for justice for Eleanor Vance. After a long silence, Diana agreed to talk, and with her words, the entire case cracked wide open. This was the aha moment. Diana told Rossi that Vinnie Rizzo was obsessed with Ellie. He had seen her at the Gilded Lily, where he sometimes conducted business, and had become infatuated. He had tried to approach her once, sending over a drink, but Ellie had politely and publicly turned him down. The rejection had enraged him. Then, her voice trembling, Diana described the night of October 28, 1988. She had been working a late shift. Around 11 p.m., she was in a back storeroom when she saw something through a crack in the door leading to the alley. She saw Arthur Finch, Vinnie's quiet, menacing fixer, struggling with a large, rolled-up oriental rug. He was wrestling it out of his van and dragging it toward the basement entrance. As he heaved it through the door, something small fell from the end of the carpet and landed on the pavement. It was a woman's shoe, an elegant dark blue heel. Finch quickly picked it up, glanced around nervously, and disappeared into the basement. A few minutes later, Vinnie Rizzo himself came out, his face like thunder, and locked the basement door from the outside. Diana knew something terrible had happened. She had kept her silence for 35 years, terrified of what Vinnie and his associates would do to her if she spoke up. Detective Rossi now had it all. The motive, Vinnie's obsessive infatuation and rage at being rejected. The method, Finch abducting Ellie from the parking lot, likely rolling her into the carpet. The location of the crime, the basement of the Starlight Lounge, the framing of the fiancé, the stolen and pawned watch, and the final damning piece of evidence, the ring, accidentally dropped in a box during the chaotic cover-up, a single mistake in an otherwise meticulously planned crime. The dark, blurry outline of the truth was finally in sharp, terrifying focus. Rossi knew who did it, she knew how they did it, and she knew why. Now all that was left was to face the monster who had been hiding in plain sight for over 3 decades. With the cocktail waitress's testimony, the scattered pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place, revealing a story far more disturbing than a simple argument between lovers. This was not a crime of passion. It was a crime of possession, fueled by a powerful man's wounded pride. The narrator for the dark truth was Vincent Rizzo. His infatuation with Eleanor Vance, a woman who embodied a grace and class he could never buy, had curdled into a dangerous obsession. Her polite but firm public rejection was an insult he could not tolerate. He decided that if he couldn't have her, no one would. On the night of October 28, 1988, he put his plan into motion. He knew Ellie and Richard were dining at the Gilded Lily. He had his fixer, Arthur Finch, wait in the shadows of the parking lot. When Ellie emerged alone, Finch, a man accustomed to following Vinnie's orders without question, grabbed her. It was a violent struggle. Ellie fought back, and in the chaos, her purse fell, its contents scattering across the cobblestones. Her engagement ring, a symbol of a life Vinnie could never be a part of, was ripped from her finger. Finch subdued her, bundled her into his van, and drove the 2 blocks to the Starlight Lounge, taking her through the alley to the basement entrance. Down in the dark, damp cellar, Vinnie was waiting. He confronted a terrified but defiant Ellie. He wanted to see her break. He wanted to see fear in her eyes. But when she refused to give him the satisfaction, his rage exploded. He struck her, and in a final, brutal act, he ended her life. The cover-up was immediate and methodical. To throw the police off his trail, Vinnie concocted a plan to frame the fiancé. He had Finch break into Richard Hayes' apartment and steal the one item he knew was a personal gift from Ellie, his gold watch. Pawning it under his own initials was an act of pure arrogance, a hidden signature on his crime. He was confident it could never be traced back to him. In the chaos of cleaning the basement, the engagement ring, which Finch had picked up from the parking lot, was dropped into a small tin box Vinnie used for storing trivial items. The box was hastily shoved behind a loose brick in the wall. It was a minor oversight, a single loose thread. Soon after, the basement flooded and was sealed, entombing the one piece of evidence that held the entire truth. Armed with the full horrifying story, Detective Rossi knew it was time. There would be no more questions, no more investigation. There would only be accountability. The first arrest warrant was for Arthur Finch. Detectives found him living in a modest, rundown house in a working-class neighborhood. The intimidating fixer from 1988 was gone. In his place was a stooped, frail man in his late 70s, his health failing. He seemed more surprised than scared when the police arrived. He denied everything at first, reciting the same denials he had held on to for 35 years. But as Detective Rossi laid out the evidence, the waitress's testimony about the rolled-up carpet, the shoe, the pawn ticket for the watch, the color drained from Finch's face, his wall of silence, so carefully maintained for decades, crumbled in a matter of minutes. In a halting, raspy voice, he confessed everything. He told them how he abducted Ellie, how Vinny had been waiting in the basement, and how he had disposed of Ellie's body on a remote piece of hunting land Vinny owned deep in the Francis Marion National Forest. He claimed he never touched her, that it was all Vinny. It was the desperate, self-serving confession of a weak man who had long ago traded his conscience for his boss's protection. With Finch's confession recorded, there was only one target left. The final scene was set on the sun-drenched, manicured landscape of Kiowa Island. A convoy of unmarked police cars rolled silently through the gates of the expensive community, pulling up to a sprawling mansion overlooking the ocean. This was Vincent Rizzo's kingdom, a world built on top of a dark and violent secret. Detective Rossi and her team approached the front door. Vinny answered himself, dressed in expensive linen clothes, a look of mild annoyance on his face. He was the image of untouchable wealth and power. "Vincent Rizzo," Rossi began. "I'm Detective Isabella Rossi with the Charleston Police Department. We need to ask you some questions about the disappearance of Eleanor Vance in 1988. A flicker of something, not fear but amusement, crossed Vinny's face. 1988? That was a lifetime ago. I don't know what you're talking about." His denials were slick and practiced. He was dismissive, almost laughing at them. Then, Rossi held up a clear evidence bag. Inside was the pawn ticket. "We know you pawned Richard Hayes's watch on November 1st, 1988, Mr. Rizzo. Your initials are right here." Vinny's confident smirk wavered. His eyes narrowed. "That doesn't prove anything." "You're right," Rossi said, her voice calm and steady. "It doesn't, but this does." She held up a second evidence bag. Inside, the sapphire on Ellie's ring seemed to catch the sunlight, shining a brilliant, accusing blue. "We found it, Vinny. We found it in the basement of your old bar." At the sight of the ring, Vinny's composure finally shattered. The mask of the legitimate businessman fell away, revealing the face of the cornered killer from 35 years ago. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by a pure, animal panic. He began to stammer, to deny, but the words were empty. The ring, his single forgotten mistake, had finally come back to claim him. "Vincent Rizzo," Detective Rossi said, her voice clear and firm as she produced the handcuffs. "You're under arrest for the kidnapping and murder of Eleanor Vance." As they led him away from his palace, a man defeated by a ghost from his past, the long, dark story finally had its ending. With the culprit's confession, the brutal truth finally came to light, proving that perseverance can overcome decades of silence. If stories of justice like this inspire you, leave a like to support our research. Following his confession, Arthur Finch, the man who had been Vinny Rizzo's shadow for so long, led investigators deep into the sprawling wilderness of the Francis Marion National Forest. He pointed them to a remote, overgrown plot of land, a place he hadn't visited in 35 years but whose location was seared into his memory. There, after a careful and painstaking excavation, authorities found what remained of Eleanor Vance. The search was finally over. Faced with Arthur Finch's damning testimony, the DNA evidence from the ring, and the irrefutable link of the pawn ticket, Vincent Rizzo's legal options were non-existent. To avoid a trial and the certainty of a guilty verdict, the once powerful man who had hidden behind a veneer of respectability for decades accepted a plea deal. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, condemned to spend the rest of his days in a world devoid of the luxury and power he had killed to protect. For his cooperation, Arthur Finch received a reduced sentence for his role in the kidnapping and cover-up. Justice, delayed for more than 3 decades, had finally been served. Weeks later, on a quiet, sunlit afternoon, a funeral was held for Eleanor Vance. Family and friends gathered not to mourn a ghost, but to celebrate a life. The empty chair that had haunted the Vance family for 35 years could finally be filled with memories, with stories, with love. They laid her to rest, a final heartbreaking act of closure that had once seemed impossible. The news of the arrest and confession brought another, different kind of closure. Richard Hayes received a formal, public apology from the Charleston Police Department, officially clearing his name in the eyes of the world. In a private, tearful meeting, Markham and Laura Vance offered their own apologies, mending a wound that had festered for decades, caused by a crime neither of them could have imagined. A few days after the funeral, Detective Rossi met with Markham and Laura at their family home. She carried a small velvet box. She spoke to them not as a detective, but as a woman who had come to know their daughter through the echoes she left behind. Then she opened the box. Inside, cleaned and polished, was Ellie's engagement ring. The sapphire seemed to absorb the light in the room, its blue depths holding a history of love, loss, and an impossible journey home. She handed the ring to Markham. He held in his hands the beginning and the end of the story, the symbol of his daughter's stolen future, now transformed into a testament to the truth. For 35 years, it had been a missing piece of their family's soul. Now, it was returned. It could not erase the pain or bring back the years of uncertainty, but it was a tangible piece of justice. It was an answer, and sometimes, an answer is a form of peace. The story of Eleanor Vance is a reminder that the truth, no matter how deep it is buried, can be brought into the light. It's a testament to the courage of witnesses who choose to break their silence, the dedication of investigators who refuse to let a case go cold, and the unexpected discoveries made by everyday people with a passion for the past. It proves that even after decades of silence, a single forgotten object can speak with a voice loud enough to shatter lies and deliver justice. The story of Eleanor Vance teaches us that no voice should be silenced forever. Your subscription isn't just a click. It's an echo that amplifies these stories and strengthens our community. Please, help this community get louder and stronger. Subscribe, and let us know in the comments from which city you watch this incredible conclusion.